you very much, and thank you everyone for this great opportunity. I will now try to share my screen. As you can see, my topic is connectivity and Marketcraft in EU-Japan cooperation in global energy and climate governance. And to give the basic framework of that, connectivity between EU and Japan is most notably frameworked by fairly recent agreements, which is the Economic Partnership Agreement of 2018 and the Strategic Partnership Agreement, which is a bit larger, of 2019, in which is also embedded a partnership for sustainable connectivity and quality infrastructure. So this is the framework that we're looking at if we're talking about EU-Japan cooperation and connectivity. And the interesting part is that particularly within the third agreement, the Partnership for Sustainable Connectivity and Quality Infrastructure, we see that energy and climate governance, or generally energy and climate projects, do play a very significant role. A quick estimate within my study gave that, showed that there is about half, a little bit less, maybe 45% of projects that are being done or planned between EU and Japan cooperation are in fact in some way energy related. So this is in no way a small amount, which is probably not that surprising considering that energy and climate are two topics that are fairly global and that do require some sort of international cooperation and governance. Now, the background for all this is, as we already touched upon several times, is of course the geopolitical and geoeconomic shifts that are happening around the world now, and the EU-Japan partnership is oftentimes viewed, again, unsurprisingly, in the context of, for instance, the shifts that are brought about by rising China, or rather maybe risen China, and are sort of compared to the Belt and Road Initiative, although it's not completely comparable. They're also discussed in the framework of a changing US leadership. So these are also parts and topics that I will touch upon during my presentation, but the main purpose actually is to start and rethink once again, maybe concept-wise, what we're actually talking about when we are talking about connectivity in the case of EU and Japan, and also of course in other cases, and how connectivity may be different, in fact, from just simple cooperation, let's put it that way. That has been definitely happening before that, but connectivity is somewhat a new concept that has risen in the recent years and that has gained remarkable attention. So this is something that I would like to start with. And there are basically two main arguments that my paper makes in this context, and one argument is sort of my argument and the other one is not so much my argument. So the first argument would be, if we want to talk about connectivity, we're basically talking about markets. So in fact, my claim is that the most fundamental form of connectivity and connectivity creation is the creation of markets, because it is markets that enable the comprehensive exchange of resources, products, and services, and they connect individuals and of course also aggregate actors on different levels by enabling this exchange. So better developed and more integrated markets are well, able to produce stronger and more diverse and more stable flows of goods, services, capital, people, whatever you know, and thereby they create the very essence of connectivity. So this is something that's basically my claim. And the second claim that sort of is connected to that is a claim that I borrow from a political economist, namely Stephen Vogel, which is that markets don't just exist. They need to be created and they need to be governed. And this is basically what we are talking about then when we are talking about creating connectivity. It is talking about creating markets and making them work. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go into all the details of Vogel's argument because obviously it's fairly complicated and he has written well, I would rather say several books on that in one way or the other, but just to get to the main points. The idea that Vogel presents stems from the contrasting view between the market liberal approach that has been dominant for quite a while in the past years, where basically we're talking about stripping away obstacles for markets to work. And he presents it with an alternative perspective on markets and says that basically it's not about stripping away obstacles, but it's rather about creating institutions that make markets work. And depending on how well those institutions are thought through and how well they fit together, markets may work better or worse. This is the sort of the argument in a nutshell. So it's, for him, he calls it the market institutional view. It's important to create those complementary working institutions. And for that, he is looking at 3 different levels that are probably familiar to all of you. So we are talking about different types of institutions that can be created and can be governed and can be basically complemented. So we have norms and beliefs, we have practices and standards and laws and regulations. Some of them are more formal institutions, some of them are less formal institutions or even informal institutions, but in the end it is important that they all fit together. That is the argument, and that they go hand in hand to produce a framework in which exchanges, whatever kind of exchanges, can and will work. Now, usually when we're talking about institutions, it's something that we tend to discuss, is to say that informal institutions are more difficult to change, are more difficult to control, are more difficult to sort of create. But formal institutions such as laws is something that at least the government has more control over. So it is unsurprising that the starting point, when we now plunge into the case study, if you will, of the EU-Japan connectivity, is something that always starts with, well, we have a good foundation, we have shared norms and beliefs. And this is something that many researchers who work on EU-Japan connectivity basically point out, that EU and Japan are natural partners in a way, because they share this level of norms and beliefs. And then there are different norms and beliefs that are usually brought up. So this is something that should come up naturally and should work naturally, right? But at the same time, and this is also something that the literature shows quite well, is that we do not really have the full potential achieved yet. So maybe a little bit like with EU and the ASEAN. And why is that? Well, there are different arguments that are made to explain this, but again, many things come down to distance. So it's about, well, these two partners are fairly distant partners. They are probably, or at least up until now, the argument is that the EU as well as Japan were fairly preoccupied with regional issues, not so much with global issues. Maybe there is also the issue of the priority of the partnership with the US. And these are things that basically are considered to be or to have been stumbling blocks. At the same time, many are now viewing the changing global environment as an opportunity to bring those two partners closer together because of, you know, US decline, which sort of opens up a new spot for both partners to engage with. At the same time, new threats and maybe other challenges. And energy and climate are also arguments that are sort of pushing those two partners together, in particular with regard to climate governance, that is becoming more and more salient in recent years as an issue that needs to be addressed on a global level, and in particular with regard to a retreating US, at least until under the presidentship of President Trump, and maybe a China that is still a little bit struggling to balance the goals of growth and environment. Many say that this is also the climate issue, something where Japan and EU can cooperate and create leadership. This is not that new. So obviously we have heard in the previous presentation that cooperation on energy matters has been going on for quite a while. It's for EU and Japan, it's very similar. They have started after the old crises of the 70s, more or less. But, and this is what I argue in my paper, the actual institution building or the questions about institutions, they only came with the 1990s, so to speak. This is where we starting to see some sort of government's approaches, and they are all linked to the rising climate change awareness all over the world. And this is also the time where Japan, maybe it's more the 21st century, starts to look a little bit to the EU as sort of a role model. But what we also see is that while there is some sort of a common ground and while there is more cooperation, there is also a fairly visible stumbling block in terms of hierarchy of what the priority is. Because of course, both Japan and the EU are trying to achieve energy security in terms of supply security and decarbonization. But you see that Japan prioritizes energy security quite a little bit more, while the EU is more focused, maybe at least within those Marketcraft activities, focused a little bit more on decarbonization, which has a lot of which can be basically explained by different interests and different environments on the more domestic level. Also, we have the issue when we look at the domestic or more internal level, let's say, put it that way, that we have a different organization of energy and climate policies, which are integrated in the EU, but separate in Japan. You have the more laws and regulations focused approach in the EU that tries to basically exert Marketcraft via laws and regulations, via Japan sort of prefers to gravitate towards practices and standards. And those stumbling blocks basically result in the fact that Japan and the EU still have difficulties to cooperate or to build a united front in international fora. But they now have the more and more the economic opportunity that sort of present them with the possibility to strengthen the Marketcraft. And in my paper, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'm focusing on basically two areas. One is more the clean energy market and renewable energy market as an economic opportunity where theoretically something can happen, and the other is the LNG market. And the result from that is basically that the renewable energy market is probably not that conducive to Marketcraft because first of all, it's highly focused on electricity, which is probably not going to be a globally traded commodity anytime soon. And on the other hand, we have a gravitation towards hardware markets, which are already global. So there's probably not that much room for additional Marketcraft. This is different in the LNG markets that are basically, as Japan puts it, I think fairly well characterized by a sort of a catch-22 problem, whereby a range of global transactions is basically limited by a lack of an adequate institutions. So LNG markets are not yet global, and it's kind of difficult to make them global. This has a lot to do with the fact that they're dominated by long-term contracts and there are not that many spot market exchanges. But in order to change that, we basically need to build up new institutions and new markets for this, the LNG trade to become really global. And this will probably not happen by itself because there's basically a lack of a crucial amount of people who participate. So this is where, yes, I know.
Diana, time is running out. So could you wrap
2 more
up
minutes.
in 1 minute? Yep.
Okay, so this is where basically EU and Japan can cooperate, and this is what they do. So they have presented a few laws and regulations already during meetings and workshops. But, and this is basically the last main point that I'm going to make, the old problems are still salient in the sense that the EU is basically gravitating toward different priorities than Japan. And I think the biggest problem in this context is the creation of or the dissemination of practices and standards, because, for instance, the EU is very set on saying that we actually want to phase out of fossil fuels, which means that we don't really want to invest in a lot of new fossil fuel related projects, which would be LNG projects, whereas Japan is trying to basically spread this or enhance the number of participants and further continues to invest. And I think this is a part where it really shows that the stumbling blocks are still there and need to be overcome. I don't think that I'm going to go through the whole conclusion because we are basically run out of time, but these are the points that I tried to make throughout my presentation. And if you're interested, you can always look them up a little more in more detail in my paper. So thank you very much for the attention.